Hi everyone. A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have people from all over joining today. So from wherever you are, welcome to this session. I think I'm really looking forward to the conversations today, and I hope you are too. Today, we are going to be talking about publication guidelines for submission success. And just to share some context about why we're doing this, we have over the last couple of years done a lot of events for authors, and through all those sessions the consistent feedback we've received is, there are a lot of online courses, a lot of training material, a lot of handbooks, guidebooks, ebooks, everything available for how do we navigate the publication journey. But what we really truly need is the journal editor's perspective. We need maybe a peer reviewer's perspective, but because they are, in a sense, the gatekeepers for the manuscript. They are the ones who you are writing for as an author, and what is important to the journal editor. And I think this has been consistent feedback that we have received. So this session today is a series. It is the first in the series of bringing you these perspectives. My name is Roohi Ghosh. I am the ambassador for researcher success at Editage, and I basically try and bridge the gap between the diverse stakeholders in academia. So and bring to the fore the voice for the researcher. What are the challenges that they are facing as they navigate the publication journey with so many changes taking place in the industry? What is it that authors need today? So my role is to bring that to the fore. And before we begin, and I introduce you to today's speaker, I will very quickly tell you a little bit about Editage. At Editage, what we provide is services, basically everything that a researcher needs all in one place, whether it is services, whether it is AI tools, whether it's their solutions, basically to help guide the early, mid, senior researcher through every stage of their publication journey. Whether you are writing, you're doing your literature review, you need learning courses, you need sessions, you just need author resources, you need a writing tool. Research promotion app. It could be anything, and I think you will find whatever a researcher needs all in one place with Editage. So I hope that at this session, and even after, you do take some time to go through and to understand some of the services that we have today. I'm going to be introducing you to our speaker and our guest for today. That's Amy Sampson. Amy is the Associate Director for Online Learning at the University of Greenwich, and a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Learning Development in Higher Education, which is an established international educational journal focused on pedagogic practice. Amy is passionate about creative arts education and has worked in higher education for 19 years, covering a variety of digital education and technical roles. Her work has received recognition, including winning the 2023 UCI SA Supporting Excellence in Learning, Teaching, and Research Award. She is a principal fellow of advanced higher education, holds an MA in creative education, and reviews for two other educational journals. So I'm sure we're going to have a lot to learn from her today. And we have over 40 questions that have already come into us, and I'm expecting a lot more. Just in the event that we're not able to take on all the questions, we promise that we will respond to your queries on Editage Insights, which is our author resources platform. So you can always check that out later. But Amy, thank you for being here today and for sharing and for agreeing to be a part of this and sharing your insights with us.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, really pleased to be invited, and hopefully you'll kind of get a sense of a bit of an insight from an editor's perspective today.
Yes, thank you. Very, very excited for this conversation. So like I mentioned, one question that has come up consistently, not just in the questions we received as we started talking about this session, but even otherwise, is what role do you think that clarity and structure of a manuscript plays in the review process, and what does it really take to like how should an author go about writing a good paper? Could you share some tips with us, please?
Yes, of course. So obviously, structure can be quite subjective, and what you'll find on a lot of the journal pages in terms of where their aims and scopes is suggested format. So the journal that I'm representing today, we have a kind of suggested structure. So for each of the types of articles and manuscripts that we might receive, we have a kind of suggested structure with suggested word count aligned to each of those, and that's just really to help with clarity for readership. It's not saying that you have to follow it to the letter, but it just provides a structure that would be easy for any readers to digest. And I think when we as editors first look at a manuscript that's come to us, in terms of clarity, we're wanting a very kind of linear article that makes sense to our readership, because we're essentially representing our readership, and it's got to be interesting and digestible for our readers. So where you are submitting to journals and they do have a kind of rough structure, I would suggest adopting that. I mean, and some of the feedback we might have is actually, this is a really great article, but could you just put it into a slightly different format? So that you're ending with the conclusions is quite a nice place to leave it. You've got your introduction. So it's not that we rigidly stick to that, it's just for readership that really enhances it. And ultimately, as editors, that's who we're there representing when we get a manuscript, saying, right, is this clear? Does it make sense? Is there a really clear methodology? Is there really clear results? So, and it's not, when you look at a case study, sometimes that's quite different than a paper. So you might find that there's amendments to that depending on the types of article that you're publishing.
Right. I think what also helps me is just reading papers from the journal that you are submitting to aside from the guidelines, of course, but just reading the papers also, I think, just helps so much.
Yeah, and actually just making if you've got kind of critical friends around you that might be able to just give your article a first pass before you submit it. Often some of the things that we're highlighting is just really simple changes to grammar or tone, but sharing your article first before you submit it might mean that a colleague or a peer might provide that feedback before it gets to a journal editor. So yeah, really it's just clarity and making sure that it is understandable for anybody looking at that article in the future.
Okay, so another question again, that over the years we've received questions from authors whose manuscripts have been rejected despite, we were talking about the research being sound, good writing. So now that we've discussed good writing, there are times that, manuscripts are still rejected despite sound research, despite the fact that the paper was written well, often due to a scope mismatch. And approximately what percentage of manuscripts do you think, get rejected for this reason? And what advice do you have for authors regarding journal selection to avoid this issue?
Yeah, so I actually did a little bit of looking into this for our last issue just to check how much roughly we were rejecting, and it was about a third, but it wasn't all due to scope mismatch. That was kind of for a variety of reasons. We've got kind of guidance on, how many articles that you might publish with us for a year, or, if it is out of scope or doesn't fit our format. So I'd say that, sorry, just going back to your question now. What was the question, Roohi? Sorry.
Yeah. So the question was, what percentage of articles roughly do you think get rejected because of scope mismatch? And what advice do you have for authors regarding journal selection to avoid this issue?
Yep. So definitely check with the journal's aims. The Journal of Learning and Development in Higher Education have got a really clear aims section and a scope section, and you'll find that on a lot of the journals, in fact it should be all of them that you're submitting to, have those clear aims and scope articulated. When I'm reviewing and editing manuscripts, sometimes you're reading them and thinking, actually, this has been written for a very specific journal that isn't ours. And you can tell when things have maybe been rejected at another publication and then they come to your publication. So a lot of the time that isn't a flat out rejection. It's actually a conversation back with the author to say, this is a fantastic article. It's not quite suitable for our readership, but if you were to draw out these themes or maybe rework the manuscript slightly so that it's positioned and more aligned to our aims and scope, then you can actually still have a successful submission. But for us, that initial conversation with the editor is putting the manuscript in the form that when you pass it on to our reviewers, they'll look at it and say, yep, definitely matches our scope, definitely suitable for our audience. And then they're looking at it from the perspective of, more detailed analysis of the article and the findings. When I'm looking at it at an editor, it's kind of actually, is this going to suit our readership? Does it fit with our aims and scope? And sometimes it doesn't. And a lot of the time it does with just a bit of repositioning. But I'd say for anybody looking to submit is, again, just checking that your article does align to the aims and scope, and even just using some of the terminology. So if there's key, we're all around pedagogy and learning development, so making sure that those terms are within the article, so that our readership is learning development professionals. So we want to know the impact for those learning development professionals, so that we've got a kind of recommendation for practice or something that our readership is going to take away from that article. And that will be the same for other journals as well. So they're really speaking on behalf of the readership and making sure that it's of interest to people who are reading our journal and looking at articles of this tone. So yeah, but I wouldn't say if it's out of scope, an editor should kind of flag that and say, actually, with a bit of positioning, it would be suitable.
Right. So then is scope mismatch something you probably check during the initial screening stage? Because I know that authors are sometimes confused about, what does the initial screening stage entail? Like, can you tell us a little more about that? And what are the most common reasons, say, for desk rejection?
Yeah. So if you make a submission, I mean, we use the OGS systems, which should be kind of familiar to a lot of people on this call. When you submit it, it will come to one of several editors. I'm very lucky in the Journal of Learning Development and Higher Education that we've got like a really strong editorial board. There's about 8-9 of us. And so it would essentially be allocated to one of the editors. We would take that manuscript. I'm looking at, word count predominantly, and that it fits our style guide. It's probably not surprising, but a lot of people don't fit a style guide. I mentioned before that sometimes a manuscript might have been created for one publication and maybe it had been declined, or maybe it was being sent to a few publications at a time. So one of the first things we're looking at is, if this has been submitted as a case study or a paper, does it fit the word count for that paper? Does it have the kind of suggested structure and format of that type of article? Does it follow our house style guide? And there's quite a lot of papers that don't and just need minor editing. It could be, that the references are in the wrong style, or you might, I do a quick reference count, how many references have we got in the paper? Are they all actually correctly referenced at the end? It could be that, a few have been missed. And really that initial submission, it then becomes, for our journal, a conversation with the editor and the author. And that might last a while, because it might be, as I've mentioned before, if you need to reposition that article, we might say to an author, actually, you need to focus on these parts, draw out some of that. And, academics and colleagues submitting are busy. So that might take, 6 weeks, 2 months. And that's very much conversation. So I work with authors and say, these are minor changes. Any chance you could get them to us in 2 weeks? And they might say, I'm on holiday, I can't do it for a month. And that's fine. I mean, we're lucky we have kind of 4 issues a year. So it can move to a future issue. And then really, once I'm happy as an editor that that's in a position that it fits the scope, it's in our house style, it fits the structure and is relevant to our readership, that's when we instigate the kind of review process. So there could be quite a lot of back and forth, or you might already have that all considered and it be quite a swift process to get through to the review stage. But that's why as editors we have to take the time on each article and just give that our oversight and check, because in giving it to the reviewers we're essentially saying we think this is at a publishable standard. Can you please now look at the article itself and more around the content and the findings and the study, whereas at an editorial level where a lot of it's quite practical, and that's kind of our role, and then the reviewing community then adds their expertise as part of the next phase.
Right. So actually, there's a question that's come in chat, which I'm going to take right now because it's related to some of the things you just spoke about. Why do most journals require papers to be in their format before submission, which takes around 2 days and then often rejects them in screening, wasting that time? So we're talking about it from the author's perspective now. So
I think the author doing a couple of days work and then it's still being rejected. Do you mean?
Yes, like the author, spending time on formatting before the paper has been sent for submission. So that takes them time, and then that gets rejected in screening. So the author time is getting utilized. Could have, like had they not had to, like, say for instance, a format, like if the formatting guidelines are different for different journals, then they have to reformat it for another journal, and that's I think the question is more about that takes so much time, and then it gets disappointing when there is a rejection or at the screening stage.
Yeah, I mean, it just, again, it helps with the readership and it helps with the structure. And to be honest, if we're then sending it out to reviewers and these things are still in place, I don't want, a series of reviewers to say, oh, well, actually, this is really great, but the font's in the wrong size and the headings aren't right and the references don't match up. So it essentially just means that for our reviewing community, that everything is at a standard that we're saying, actually, you are then having just to focus on the content and the arguments being made in the paper. So, and I know that that's time that authors are having to spend doing that, but we're all volunteers in this space and we're all having to essentially give our time alongside our roles. So yeah, at some point that would have to be tackled, and yeah, I understand that that's frustration sometimes if it's going to be rejected, but it's one of the reasons that the house styles and formatting guidance are there, because it just means that that's considered as part of the submission process.
Right, right. And I think you make a great point, right? I mean, even peer reviewers are volunteering, and it's their time also, so which is at stake. So if the basics aren't covered, then you're in effect also probably, in a sense, wasting the reviewer's time if something basic stuff is not taken care of. So
yeah, and I mean, like, editors are volunteers as well, so it's like somewhere along the line we do have, and you'll see it when you submit, there is like a copy editing process at the end. So where things, where the format isn't quite right, the idea is that those copy editors would pick up those very final tweaks, but as much as possible we want to get to the stage where we've got articles going through that follow a house style. And one of the things that our journal does really well is we've got a templated Word document structure, and so at that initial conversation with an editor and an author, if I'm saying actually it's not quite in our format, I'll just send them that template, and it's essentially then a matter of just pasting in, and it inherits that format. So there are things that journals can do to make that easier for authors, and yeah, a template is a good example of what we've started doing in our journal and has been working quite well.
that's interesting. So, since you spoke about, the crux of the paper, like journal editors need to focus on that. So, another question that has, very often being asked is, what is the most important for journal editors when they review the paper? Is it the topic, the significance of the research, or is it something else?
Oh, I think it's like a combination of all of those. I mean, journal learning development and higher education, one of the things we're really passionate about is advocating for individuals who might not have published before, junior researchers or people that might have been marginalized in academia and actually not found that they are publishing. So I wouldn't say for us it's like the impact of the research. It could be, an article and a project that's had very local findings, but actually for our readership, they can take something from that article and apply it in their own practice. That's not to say that that's the case with every journal, but again, I think having a look at the aims and the scope of that particular journal would give you a sense of what articles they are more likely to take through over others. We, take an assortment of articles and opinion pieces, but other journals don't, and their field is a lot narrower. So I think again, it comes back from looking at the journal that you're submitting to and just making sure that what you're submitting is aligned to their readership. And some journals now, will almost kind of take a mentoringship role through publication as well. So I've seen it where you kind of not, maybe you're again at a junior level or new to research and you're thinking of submitting, and actually you acknowledge that and you submit it, and you almost are assigned a mentor to work with you to shape your article. So I think for different publications it's a different focus. But I think definitely for ours, we want to publish and we want to celebrate voices in this space. So we don't reject unless we feel, that it's very out of scope and there isn't a way that we could adapt that or work with an author to get it to our readership. And sometimes, that's an author's decision. It could be the changes are too much and they don't want to make the changes, and that's fine. And they might choose to publish somewhere else. But where possible, as editors, we're going to try and work with an author to publish that work. They've obviously worked on a piece of research that is of real value. So we want to try and, work together and get that to a point that actually our readership are going to really enjoy learning about that work.
So that's I think that's so encouraging for authors to know that this is editors and reviewers aren't just out there to reject, but actually the sole purpose is to work with the author to ensure the paper reaches acceptance. So I think that is very encouraging. My next question was actually going to be about the importance of journal formatting, but I think we spoke about that a couple of times in the previous questions. So this is another one which I found particularly interesting. Again, come from the audience right now, so I'm just going to take that. For most of the researchers, it's tough to format according to every journal. Why isn't there a general format for all the journals?
Oh, I'm not sure I can answer that. I don't know. Not sure why there isn't a kind of a universal format. I guess that's what keeps us varied, isn't it? And keeps them different. And also, the same format doesn't necessarily work. A case study isn't going to be presented the same as, an opinion piece. So yeah, good question. But as I said, we're using templating within ours so that there is something there that people can kind of move things around, and it isn't fixed. It's a suggested. In terms of like fonts and etc., that's kind of fixed. But in terms of section headings and things, there is a bit of flexibility there. But the main aim is to make it easy for a readership to follow the piece. But good question.
Okay, so could you elaborate on the most common mistakes that authors make during the submission process and provide some tips on how to avoid them to increase the chances of successful publication?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the formatting. That again wouldn't be something that we would reject. I think sometimes when one of the common things is where an article's maybe trying to cover too much in one piece, and I think we talked a little earlier about having a kind of critical friend or someone who could review. Some of the time with our subject area, we've got learning development happening across a whole breadth of education. And so, if you're working in, say, a sciences space and it goes very detailed into the science area, it's almost pulling back a bit and thinking, right, would a readership who aren't as familiar with science terms, would they come to this and understand it? So I think it's again bearing in mind the readership of the journal, which our journal has that kind of articulated who our readers are, and just putting yourself in the position of those readers. Could they come to this article and know enough about this thing? Have you described it enough? If there are key theories underpinning your work, have you described those in enough detail and provided links to references that somebody new to that area could come and understand it? And so I think that's probably something that we do see. Or we talked about the scope mismatch as well. That's another kind of common reason why we might not initially reject, but have a conversation that might lead to a rejection, because actually it might be suitable for another publication. And I know, colleagues have then said this isn't quite great for ours, but actually we know of this other journal and this would totally fit with their scope, so you should submit to them. Like, we're not afraid to encourage people, because ultimately we want people to publish. But if it's not quite right for us, we will say. I think those are probably like the most common things. I think the relevancy as well, and the kind of the currency of research
Right.
has an impact as well. And again, you're coming at that from a readership point of view. What could our readership take? Is there things around their practice that they could learn from this and then apply? One of the things that I tend to work a lot with authors on is where you've got conclusions and recommendations. For our learning development community, we're looking for things that people could take and use, and recommendations. So if we've had a big manuscript that's put a lot of effort into the findings and the methodology, what are the recommendations for us as practitioners? How can we then go and take that? And sometimes it'll be a paragraph, and sometimes for us that's actually a really key part. What is there to learn from this? So, and that wouldn't necessarily be a rejection. That would be then a conversation with the author saying, this is fantastic, but could we just draw a bit more out on this section here, because that would really be of value to our readers. So yeah, I guess I'm trying to emphasize that like rejection is a really last stage for us. But I think one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, is where we have had papers that have been, you could tell they've definitely been written with another publication in mind. So again, it's then just rephrasing it for our readership.
Right. So I'm so glad you emphasize the need to have a conversation, right? Because I know that authors often worry about communicating with the journal, and there are various questions like, is it acceptable to write to the editor to inquire about the status of a paper? Is it okay? Why is the status of my paper not changed in the submission system? Could there be an issue with the paper? Is it okay to disagree with peer reviewer comments? Do you have any advice on how authors, so basically, in fact, today as well, there is a question that's come in chat that says, one of my papers is pending with the journal for 4 months, and I don't think the editor has allotted for this paper as per the communication from the journal. In such cases, what do I do? So I think this is it's a common thread and a common issue that authors face, and they're confused about, the communication with the journal. So do you have any advice for authors?
Yeah, and I can kind of explain, certainly from the Journal of Learning Development and Higher Education, I can kind of explain a bit about what the statuses are and what's happening. So when you're at that submission stage, you're kind of allocated to a journal editor. And again, this is using the OJS terms, so I'm just going to use those. But that's when that conversation happens back and forth. And I guess throughout all of this process, have to be a little mindful that usually your editors are working already at a university. So, I'm often doing this in the evenings and the weekends. So if you do get replies at different times internationally, that's probably why. And I would expect to receive some communication in that space, after a few weeks, even if it's just, hello, I'm your editor, I'm going to be working with you on this, looking forward to working together. But I'm also very mindful of how community driven our journal is. So that's kind of a norm for us, that we would reach out to our authors. That dialogue, as I said, if I'm asking for revisions or things at a very early stage, it's then working with your authors to find timescales that suit you both. So it could be you're at that submission stage for a while, but as one of the attendees was mentioning, 4 months I would say is quite a long time, and I would be tempted just to reach out and just inquire. And I don't think you'd be out of place asking for that. Once you kind of go through to that review stage in the OJS system, that would change to a review. The journal, we would ask, usually 3 reviewers to look at that submission. And again, you're then having to engage with reviewers who are also volunteers and also having to fit this in around their other commitments. And we might say, can you get this to us in a month, 8 weeks? But really, a responsible author should kind of go back to responsible editor should go back to the author and say, right, this is going out for review. We've set a deadline of 2 months, and just keep them up to date, because there's nothing worse than logging in and you've just got a status and it's hard to kind of get what's happening during that status. And that review period will happen, and again, it could be that there's revisions required as a result of that, but it should be down to your editor that's been assigned to kind of communicate with your author, just to give them an idea. And I've got a diagram that I'll try and share in here afterwards, but we've got quite a good kind of flow chart that we use on our journal, just to kind of say, right, these are the stages and this is what's happening. And with the reviewers, particularly a call for reviewers, we might be looking for reviewers with very specific expertise, in order that they can fully reflect and evaluate that article and its impact. So if we're trying to find very, specific people in specific areas, that also might take some time. But that's why I'd recommend anyone here, if you're not doing reviewing, to really do it. I mean, I find it really interesting as well, but it kind of keeps the wheels in motion for a lot of these journals, in order to have a really engaged community who are happy to review. And I guess the other thing to note is, key holidays. There's usually a delay. I've got several papers that I'm working on at the minute, and I'm having to be mindful of people's family commitments and their home life. So it's actually working together and finding timescales. And, as I mentioned, our journal has 4 publication points in a year. So there's always one that we're working towards. Other journals that might only have 1 or 2 issues a year, your timescales are going to align to that. And if after review and it's been accepted, there's still that copy editing piece as well to do before you would be submitted. So it can be quite a long process, but that's dependent on a number of factors. But I definitely say, if you've not heard, I would reach out personally. But I know that's because we're a very engaged journal community.
So this is actually related to communicating with the journals. So I'm just going to take this question again from the audience. I had a research paper in one of the journals 2 years ago, and it was accepted for publication, but it was not published. I sent an email to the editor-in-chief to withdraw the research, but he did not respond. What should I do?
Oh, it's like an agony aunt section there. I don't know. I'd still try and get in touch, to be honest. Or if the journal's published as behalf of an organisation, just try and reach out and see if you can find someone else. It could be that they've moved on. I mean, I don't know the example for this particular one, but try and find mechanisms to contact them. Otherwise, as I mentioned, a lot of people working in editorial roles are working at other universities at the same time, other education organisations. So, finding other ways to reach out, or finding other people on the editorial board that you might be able to contact and say, well, actually, I have messaged, but I haven't heard back. I'd like to withdraw it, because it's, within your right to withdraw it. And you should be able to find somebody within the journal who can communicate. But yeah, good luck. I hope you do find someone.
So, since we're discussing this, I think another question and another point of confusion is always the manuscript status. So many authors, they struggle with understanding the status of their manuscript in submission systems. So could you, maybe talk a little bit about the typical statuses seen in the manuscript submission systems and what they would mean?
Yeah. To mention a little bit about some of my last answers, but as I mentioned, we're on the OJS Open Journal systems. So your initial status would be submission, and that's the point where you're going back and forth with an editor. At the point then you go out to review, that then would change to a review status, which would be a slightly different color. And then once that review status has happened, and it could be you've got a few iterations of that, but you should be kept up to date. For example, if it did come back with minor amends, your editor should get in touch with you, work with you to do the amends, set a timeline, submit it back through OJS. It would go out for a second review, but that status would stay the same. Once your reviewers came back and accepted it, I mean, usually it's like unanimously. It's one of the reasons we do kind of 3 reviews, so that if you do have, 2 saying yes and 1 saying no, there's a majority there. That would then work to a copy editing status, which then is really your final hurdle to getting published. So it's on the way. It's just then going to copy editors for those final tweaks and ready for publishing. So yeah, it's those 3 main statuses that you should see. But I'd say some of those will take longer, but you should be in communication with your editor, and they should be communicating with you to keep you up to date. But again, I'm very mindful I'm representing a journal that's very invested in keeping our authors up to date on their submissions.
So, what are the typical timelines, say, for instance, from submission to publication of articles?
I'm not going to commit, Roohi, because there's no typical timeline. Again, it's working with the author's availability as much as the editor availability. Sometimes, we might be very close to publication and we wouldn't have time to put it very quickly through. And if we've got an issue that's looking already very full, and we already know that there's a lot of work going to our copy editor team, which is a fixed, they've only got so much time, that might impact when things are published. Those conversations back and forth between editors might mean that revisions are required. So I'd say there's so many factors that affect it that it isn't a kind of clear cut. And if we are requesting authors make changes, it's again fitting in with their availability and when they want to make the changes. So, we're not very forceful, particularly for our journal, in saying, right, it needs to be in for this time. It's definitely a conversation. So we'll suggest a deadline and they might say, yep, we can do it sooner, and that'll be great. But again, it's all driven on community and volunteers. So it's being mindful that these are things that people are having to fit in. But, once it's out and published, like that's what everyone essentially is working towards.
Right, right. So then the next question is, I think, an authorship related one, and I think it's an important one to address. So we'll probably move to that. It's coming from the audience today. How can one resolve the issue of first and second author positions of a manuscript? Should one refer to the volume of each contributor, to the journal guidelines, or to the research rank?
Oh, I don't know, probably one that I'll have to defer. It's different for different journals. I mean, we don't kind of define who's done what very clearly in our journals. We'll speak to kind of a corresponding author predominantly. So as part of our submission process, we'll ask one of the authors to nominate themselves, and that would be the person that we would converse with. But how that research is kind of structured within the paper would be very much dependent on how those authors had decided to represent their research. So I wouldn't say it's like a one size fits all for us, but and you'll find on kind of the OJS that you can have different authors in there assigned to a paper, and they'll get the notifications, but really an editor's going to want to be liaising with one of those authors. And again, that impacts the timescales, because if you're saying certain amendments need to happen, that corresponding author would then go back to their other co-authors, and then, find out ways kind of collaboratively to make those changes. So yeah, again, really not a one size fits all for this, but I'd say, have a look at the guidance for that particular journal.
Right, right. And I think a large part of it is also about who's contributed probably most to the paper. I think that should be the guiding, the
Yeah,
guiding.
yeah, and if you haven't got named authors on there that are integral to the paper, but they aren't named, including them in an acknowledgement section, that's
Right,
always another way that you can show gratitude to others that have been involved in the paper.
right, right. So there's like we have so many questions. So there's a lot of research that is happening today. There's a lot of papers that are getting published. What can authors do to make their research stand out, so that it doesn't stay buried under, like, say, a pile of already published work?
So again, I was speaking very much from Journal of Learning Development and Higher Education, is the relevance to the audience. So I think, keeping material kind of current, relevant, based on current studies and current topical debates for us, higher education and education more generally. I think that is something that we look for our readership, because it's something that our readership are interested in. And again, that comes back to the aims and the scope and the value. So one of the reasons, again, where we have a lot of different formats, that you can then have an opinion piece, or we have like book reviews and things, as well as kind of a traditional manuscript. So there are different ways that you can publish, and we're definitely an organisation that's very supportive of publishing and promoting voices in education. So I'd say, have a look again at the aims, but it's got to be something that you're interested in and you really enjoy. It's a lot of time to invest in doing the research and publishing. So yeah, have a look for where you'd ideally want to be publishing and the areas that you would want to be known, and then finding a journal that fits the kind of work that you want to do. But yeah, there are a lot of voices, but it's just getting your work out there, I think, and that's something that our community are quite passionate about doing.
So with I think again, this is this with the open access movement, with the rise of AI, academia is constantly evolving. How do you think these changes are impacting journals, and what should authors be aware of?
Oh, this is a session on its own, really. The impact of AI. It's ever evolving. Our journal meets monthly, like the editorial board meets monthly. So we try and stay on top of evolving trends and topics in education. And, undoubtedly AI in authorship is one of those hot topics. And you'll see on our website, there's an evolving AI policy, which kind of recognizes the current debates and, ethical considerations for using AI in publication. We ask for a kind of a statement, like a declaration, on whether you have or haven't used AI. And if you have used AI, there's a kind of prompt to say how you've used it. So it's not for our publication saying, you can't use it, but it's actually just transparency, again, for our readership, so that if you have used AI somewhere in that publication, that we're being transparent and honest about where and how we've used it. But that's our position now, today, and as this evolves, it could be we don't have those statements in the future. I don't know, but again, it's having a look for us across the sector and in publishing, and making sure that our journals kind of align to the practice happening. And again, making it as easy as possible for our authors to submit to us, and encouraging that, but acknowledging that things change and things evolve. And yeah, hence our monthly meetings where we're discussing things such as this, to say, right, how should we approach this issue or this challenge or this opportunity, and reflect it in the work that we do.
Right. So since we are discussing AI, not now many people they're using AI to like to there are some like how basically the question is about how journals can distinguish between the author writing by himself or the author using AI to help modify just the language, or
Yeah.
the author writing using AI, like completely AI content. So, how would a journal distinguish that? And a related question that's come in the chat is how can editors limit over submission of papers in an ethical way?
Yeah. Two very big very big areas. So for us, like, we rely on that declaration being completed by the author. So we go back to the author, and it's part of our style guide that you need to include a statement on AI and how you've used it, or if you're declaring that you haven't used it. Where this becomes, the line becomes quite blurred is if you're maybe an international author and you're using AI to help with some of the translation elements, or even just using, Grammarly and things like that. It's kind of where the line is on some of this, and having that communication with your editor then becomes key, because actually what you're doing, it might be, minor grammar changes, which again we call out in our policy that that's fine, you don't have to declare it. But it's that communication, and that'll evolve, as different topics come in and out. There'll be different things that we have to consider, but for us it's a conversation about how you're using it, if you're using it, and just being transparent. But that's me speaking from our policy at the journal. So others might be different on that stance, but again, it's just transparency. So it's not like we're not going through and running things through checkers or anything like that. It's literally just asking our authors to be transparent on their use and just declaring how, so that our readership are aware of that within the submission.
Right, right. And what so I think now this is for new researchers or new authors who are submitting to journals for the first time. What advice would you give them as they're starting out?
So we talked a little earlier about supported submission routes, and there are those kind of mentorship opportunities with some journals to give you a kind of editor to work alongside, so that you can adapt and work with someone to help shape your article with the aim of getting it published. So that's a potential route. I think journals such as ours really encourage those that are new to research. I mean, I think having a supportive community really helps with that, and we offer various webinars and things, and the same with your organization, Roohi, and how to get people publishing. But I think if you
Right.
don't try and start putting things in, it's almost like the feedback that you're getting out of that process will help form your writing going forwards. And it could be, start off with journals that are taking smaller submissions, or work in collaboration with a colleague who is maybe more experienced with publishing. But you've got to start somewhere, I think, if this is an area that you're interested in, and just keep trying. And ultimately, it's good to have work represented in these publications. So you should find a supportive community. But I'm very aware I'm speaking from learning development, which is very supportive in its nature. But yeah, and just asking colleagues, if you've got colleagues that have published, for any advice or tips. And we mentioned about it earlier, but being a reviewer yourself, and staying on top of research yourself, and because then you're essentially part of that editorial process, and you're getting a sense of the common things that people are looking for, and just gets you into that headspace a bit more. Plus, if you're reviewing for an area that's close to your own specialism, it's interesting just from a development point of view to listen to other people's practice and read about other people's findings. So and also just giving back to your community. Like, I'm a real advocate for helping support development. So getting involved with reviewing and attending any like webinars, and just starting to publish yourself either in collaboration or through kind of junior routes in the journals.
I think that's great advice, and I hope this helps. It helps all those who are just starting out. I think we also received some questions from those who were interested in becoming editors themselves, because the question is about how can someone become an editorial member. So, if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I've not done that much publishing. I've got to kind of hold my hands up because I'm not a very confident writer, and it takes me quite a lot to write something. And one of the things that I started doing was entering a reviewing community, and I found that really, really valuable. In a few kind of my key subject areas. So my background's very much digital learning, so I review for a kind of digital learning focused journal. Academic development is another. And quite often, as what happened with the Journal of Learning Development and Higher Education, they had a kind of guest editor vacancy, which quite often journal publications do. If they're running a special issue or they know that they're going to have a lot of submissions, they might put an open call out for a guest editor. And so I applied for that, and was partnered with a current editor and learnt so much from them. And then actually when the board did have a vacancy, I then felt confident enough to say, actually, I really enjoy it. I'd like to contribute further. And, that was an interview process, and I got it, and that's great. But quite often, as we've kind of alluded to, there's a lot of voluntary work going into these publications behind the scenes. So if there is a journal that you're particularly interested in, just following some of their social media and just keeping an eye out for calls for participants. And that might be at a reviewer level to start off with, but just really then kind of building up your confidence on the processes behind the scenes, and actually keeping an eye out for editor positions. And as I mentioned, I'm very lucky to work with like a really key group of people in my journal, headed up by Alicia Siska. And it's a great community, but it's only as good as the effort that everyone's putting in to kind of keep it going in the community. So find one that you invested in and you're actually really excited about contributing to.
Okay, so this is an interesting one also coming in chat, and I think it addresses the elephant in the room. So, while submitting my paper and searching for journals, I found that most international journals charge $500 to $2,500, which seems excessive. Do you think these fees should be decreased because they're making too much money?
I mean, I'm very mindful. I work for an open access free journal. And I'm a total advocate for open access articles. So I'm not going to be the right person to answer about this. But I feel like, there should be more routes for open publication, and I'm proud to work with an organization that supports that. So can't speak too much to that one really, but our journal's free, and it's free to submit to, and free to access for anyone.
Right. I think that's a great model. In fact, a lot of journals are trying to experiment, which is why they're also looking towards becoming more author-centric now, with with the whole open access movement. So yes, I do. While this is a problem, I think things are hopefully slowly changing as well.
Yeah, hopefully.
And so, yeah, there are a couple of more questions that we have, and I'm mindful that we just have 6 minutes left. So, if there are any other questions that anybody has, just a quick reminder to please send in your questions to us. Um, the next one is could you have what are the things that publishers look for in an article other than the guidelines followed or not? I know you spoke about this in when we started, but if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
So the Journal Learning Development Higher Education is actually published as part of OLDI, which is the Association for Learning Development in HE, and through that organisation we have a set of kind of core values that run through all of the work that's done by the organisation. So although we have aims and scope in particular for the journal, really our values run through anything that the organisation is doing. So if a topic or a subject area aligns to those values, it's worth kind of pulling that out in part of your article. And that's not just kind of specialist to us, like that happens across other journals, but even just having a look through past issues, special issues. As I mentioned, ours is open access, so you can have a look at kind of some of the keywords and the key areas that we're focusing on as a journal, and just making sure that those types of subjects are covered in your paper would also indicate that it's a good fit for us as a publication. So yeah, and that also helps with kind of tone and positioning and things like that, also just getting a sense of, you know, the length of articles and how arguments are structured and how an opinion piece might be written. So it just gives you a flavour for the kind of publication history and yeah, what types of article are making it through to the final issue.
Oh, I think this was our last question, but thank you, Amy, very very much. I think this has been a great learning experience for me as well, and I think a great conversation. I am so glad that I had the opportunity to chat up with you in this way, and thank you very much again for taking the time out to do this for us.
Cool. Thank you so much for asking me. I'm really hoping that some of that perspectives from me really just encourages people to engage with publishing. And yeah, it's been fantastic to join you, Roohi. That's been great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If there are any other questions you have which have not yet been answered, please reach out to us. We will possibly just answer it on our on Editage Insights, which is our author resources platform. We'll be sharing a link to that in the chat now. And there's also a link to the feedback form. So if you have any suggestions for improvement, please feel free to share that with us, because this, like I mentioned, is the first in a series of events to bring you the journal editor's perspective. So I think the next one will be scheduled for sometime early September, and I hope to see you then as well. Once again, thank you, Amy. This was a great conversation, and thank you very, very much for sharing your insights and perspectives with us.
Thank you for having me.